So, hi Woody.
Hi, Rod.
It's actually the first day of May in 2014, and I'm here in Gainesville, Florida with Woodie Hartman on one of his visits. And I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you is something that I forgot to ask you before. You were there when the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act were being designed and discussed in Congress, and you gave testimony about that. Can you describe your testimony and that whole experience, but also just sort of the promise of the times that you felt with all that? Give us a feeling for those that are younger that weren't there, what it was like.
It was the first and only time I've ever testified in Washington, and I don't know who was responsible for choosing the representatives of the various marine mammals to appear at these subcommittee hearings. There was a House subcommittee, and then later a Senate subcommittee hearing. For me, it was, I never thought much about the act itself. It seemed like a no-brainer to me. Of course, we need to protect these marine mammals. And marine mammal research back then was, it wasn't in its infancy, but it was in its adolescence. And I don't remember all of the representatives of marine mammal research who were there, except I do remember Roger Payne was there representing whales, and there was some man representing polar bears and some man representing the pinnipeds. Don't remember who that was. And there was a wonderful old guy named Ted Walker who had been studying gray whales. And again, there wasn't a lot of information on any of these animals. And he was controversial because he was insisting that the gray whales fed after they left their feeding grounds in the subarctic, wherever it is up there, and came down to Baja California to breed. And everyone else was saying, oh, no, they don't do that. They have this long fast. They come down and they mate and they reproduce their calves and they go back up. And he said, no, they stop and feed. And I think he was ultimately proved right. But it was a collection of the relatively few researchers who were doing their work back then, and a chance for us all to meet and mix it up. And Ted Stevens was chair of the Senate subcommittee back then. I don't remember who chaired the House subcommittee. And we told them what we knew, which was relatively little back then, about these various mammals. And then, of course, it succeeded in passing Congress. The manatee itself you probably know this better than I do, I don't remember, it was already protected, I think, by a state statute. And so this was sort of just reinforcing the state's protective covenant. And I think now it's got, I don't know how many different edicts that protect it, a lot. But it never hurts to have the feds, chime in and add their 2 cents. So I was grateful for the experience because it's always exciting to see how Washington operates.
So what sort of things did you convey, do you remember, in that testimony? What emphasis did you give?
Well, my research at that time was just on their behavior and ecology, and it was becoming apparent to me quickly because of all the scars on their backs that that there needed to be some kind of regulations of boat speeds. But I didn't really know the impact of cold on them, except that they all took refuge in warm water. I knew nothing about the hazards they faced in the Okeechobee waterway with the canal gates closing on them. And I had put together the idea that there's no way they could help but ingest lures when they were feeding on vegetation in Kings Bay, never mind elsewhere in Florida. And that proved to be a big source of mortality in the end. But mostly it was about establishing maybe motorboat-free areas for them and trying to regulate boat speed some way or another.
Now, I know that from talking to you before that you had this important choice to make as a graduate student at Cornell, I believe. and that was whether you were going to come and work in the piney woods of Florida in the dry inland habitat looking at wild hogs, or whether you were going to get nice clear blue water and work on Manatee. So that wasn't a very difficult choice, I guess.
No, Jim Lane, who went on to the Archbold Biological Station, he went on to run the Archbold Biological Station, was my major advisor at Cornell, and I'd come back from Africa and was interested in working in the tropics or subtropics, and he knew a lot about Florida, and he had suggested, well, you know, you want to study the impact of wild boars, wild hogs on the Florida landscape, or he said, you know, it seems that more and more manatees are being turned up in springs, and if you could find you know, spring systems where you could actually get in the water with them and study them, why don't you look into that? So I did. Came down, found Crystal River.
What was it like? What was Crystal River like in those early days in terms of, like, you know, the boat traffic and so forth, and the aquatic vegetation?
It was a growing retirement community even back then. This was the late 60s. But it still had the feel of old Florida in that a lot of the local residents were mullet fishermen, commercial mullet fishermen, and there was a sport fishery there as well, a very small one. It's unrecognizable now to me. I visited it a few years ago, and there's 3 or 4 malls there, and but the area right around Kings Bay is pretty much the same. There weren't many places that you could build around Kings Bay then, and the vegetation was, hydrilla had taken over Kings Bay, and according to people I interviewed, you know, 10 or 20 years before that, it was still pretty clear, the water, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And now it's silted up all the way down there. But hydrilla had shaded out, I guess, some of the Vallisneria and other native submerged aquatics. And I don't know what its status is now. They were treating it with copper sulfate back then.
Yeah, they don't do that anymore.
Yeah. Let's see, water hyacinth was there, but it was never there in great, well, there's a lot of current, so it couldn't possibly cover the waterway there. But hydrilla it grew in great abundance, and it was quite beautiful actually underwater.
Mm-hmm.
And the manatees would come up with the first cold weather, and by the next spring, after their gathering in the main boil, most of it was gone. They did a real number
on the vegetation,
on the hydrilla especially.
Yeah.
It was a great benefit to them anyway. It's eruption there.
So you mentioned that many of the animals had scars on them, indicative of encounters with boats, and that was a source of concern to you. Like on a typical, say, weekday, was there significant pleasure boat traffic, or did it come on the weekends mostly, or how did it seem to you?
Nothing compared to what it is today, with the dive shops and the popularity of kayaking and swimming with manatees. There was none of that. I would go out and I was alone virtually every day when I was studying them on the surface in my dry suit. And even on weekends, the boat traffic was modest compared to what we have today. And especially in the bay itself, most people would go from the town right down the river to go fishing in the Gulf or fishing in the river itself. But very few people came out to the main boil around Buzzard Island. And now I've been there relatively recently, and well, you know, it's, you know, there's a lot of traffic, although they're very mindful. Certainly the dive shops, they're very mindful of maintaining, you know, moderate speed.
Oh yeah.
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 That wasn't really something people pay much attention to, so there were speedboats back then. I don't know, they regulate the speed now, don't they?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That was not the case back then, but nowhere near the traffic that there is today.
Right. So, you know, when you did your work, I know that you spent a lot of time interviewing people like fishermen and other people in other areas of the state too, not just Crystal River. And what was your take on, speaking to young people that might be considering, a career in manatee biology or marine mammal biology? What was your feeling about the value of these many anecdotal reports you got? What kind of credence did you learn to give to them? And obviously some were probably more valuable than others, but did that form a significant part of value for you?
It did. At first, I was willing to give everyone I interviewed the benefit of the doubt, but I quickly learned that there was a lot of superstition and misinformation out there. But overall, the information I gleaned from marina operators and fishing guides and drawbridge tenders and people, anyone connected with the water, in sum was of value to me. They would say, the manatees tend to avoid the center of the river because the flow there is stronger. They don't like to buck the current. They'll swim along the edge, and I'd look into that, and sure enough, that would prove true for that particular waterway. But boy, there was some real wives' tales out there about manatees. but I think that if you can interview everyone you can get your hands on, that you can put that information together and a pattern will emerge of validity.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Now, that's a much different world in terms of awareness of environmental issues now than it was, say, in the early 1970s. But it's also more challenging in a lot of ways for a young person to make a career in this area. What kind of advice do you have for young people that want to make a contribution to, say, marine mammal biology and conservation? What do you see that's changed over the years that you would suggest they pay attention to?
I would say first, pay less attention to playing video games. And when I talked with you last summer at Parlin, I think I mentioned that the sophistication of electronic gadgets is growing with leaps and bounds and seducing my son and most young people in this country, and not only young people but adults too, away from other pursuits. And I'm not sure where this is going to end up. I talked to you about the phenomenon of nature deficit disorder, about these children not being taken out when they go to school into the woods at the back of the school and shown nature. And increasingly they devote their time to this amazing array of electronic wizardry, which has them imprisoned. My son, I raised as any naturalist dad would, to look under stones and look under logs and to look at birds and so forth. But when he became an adolescent, he totally abandoned all of these things that I had taught him, and I lost all hope that that he was ever going to come back to an interest in nature. But lo and behold, 2 years ago, he became enthralled with birding, and so I'm hoping that all that effort I put into teaching him about natural history has paid off. He's a father now and a husband and has a new home and a job, so he doesn't have much time. But he feeds birds and he's keeping a list. So I think it's all about exposure, and urban kids are paralyzed with fear when they go into the woods. They're the way I'm paralyzed with fear when I go into cities. So, but with a mentor, someone who can take them in and show them, first of all, there's no reason to be afraid, and point out what any naturalist would do and any guide would do on a nature walk, can I think probably instill in them a sense of appreciation for it, and whether our youth being divorced from nature, if that divorce is going to grow with all these new seductive toys that they have, is hard to say. Hard to say. Maybe there'll be a great reaction to this sometime. And we'll all, crave things that are natural and simple.
Now, anyone that, pursues a challenging career in life is going to have periods of great difficulty and challenges that they have to overcome. And I'm sure you did when you were doing your studies. Do you have any, you've lived long enough to have been through more than one episode like that. What kind of advice do you have as a mentor figure for someone that's on the beginning end of their career? What advice do you have for how to tough it out through the hard times that are inevitable, the challenging times where you feel like giving up and you want to keep going, but it's tough to either get funding or whatever it might be?
You mean young people who are setting out to enter the field of biology or natural history specifically?
Yeah.
Oh my. You mean in terms of a course that they might take that they're struggling with?
Well, let's start this one again. So, young people that are in the beginning of their career as a, say, marine mammal biologist are going to be full of enthusiasm, but they're also going to be facing significant challenges in this day and age. And what inner resources have you found that you could draw on in those times of challenge that you would point a young person to?
Oh my, Roger, I'm not sure that I'm the one to ask that. I'm so radical in I am absolutely infatuated with nature. I have been since I was a little boy. It's taintless and incorruptible and innocent. Everything about nature, even the most ferocious animals. I love them all, and it's deeply ingrained in me. I often tell people I've never met a rattlesnake I didn't like, and I met a lot of people I didn't like, and so I don't know. I guess the question from my point of view would be, how do you instill that in someone, given all of these other distractions that this 21st century provides? Is it still possible to do that? Mm-hmm. Because when I was a kid, we didn't have most of these gadgets that I think probably had I grown up with them, I would have spent a lot more time playing video games than we didn't have them then. So I think it's all about exposure. It's always about a mentor in the end, I think, whether it's a parent or an uncle or just a friend or someone who really believes in this deeply, to get you out there and turn over a leaf on a tree and show you something, a cocoon or whatever, and you suddenly realize that's really fascinating. And so the more you can explain the workings of nature, ecological relationships, evolution, all of it, the more interesting it becomes, and you never forget that. You may tuck it away, but you never forget it. And if that can burgeon into the kind of love that I have for the natural world, you're home free. I don't know. It's about mentoring. Yeah.
Now, in our modern world, there are many competing interests that impact the environment. Crystal River, of course, pleasure boating impacts manatees, and fertilizer impacts the water quality. There are all kinds of interrelated issues and competing commercial interests and people making a living in various ways. What kind of perspective do you have on how a person that's oriented the way you are toward the natural side of that equation can navigate politically and otherwise and trying to affect positive change on behalf of the natural world?
I am such a pessimist about the fate of this planet. You just have to agitate for those issues, those policies, which you have learned will, in the long run, be detrimental to a particular environment. The example of, say, straightening out the Kissimmee River. Why would you be motivated to straighten out the Kissimmee? Well, you would have read about, who was it? The Army Corps of Engineers, do they straighten out erosion? You know, you have to be exposed to the argument for why that water needs to flow across the land and not go in a straight channel, and take any issue like that. What is it that, since I studied manatees, what is it that is apt to impact the welfare of manatees negatively? Okay, boats, introduction of exotic, well, that isn't necessarily, that benefited them in that case. But the red tide, which I don't know whether you know more about this than I do, whether that can be linked to all of the fertilizer that comes down the Peace River into Caloosahatchee Bay, along with the pesticides and herbicides. That was always my impression that was responsible for it. So then, what can I do? What can I do to first of all find out what is it that causes the red tide, and then once that's been discovered, well, if it turns out that it's fertilizer, what can we do upstream on all those fields to reduce the amount of fertilizer, or change the fertilizer, to reduce, you know, the nutrification of Caloosahatchee Bay. And you can take any issue, and you're going to you know, beat your head against the wall with the vested interests of various politicians who are in the pocket of big commercial interests, big agribusinesses, and so on. And it's going to be it's going to be a tough fight. But if you are, you know, politics is the bottom line is politics. The bottom line is money, but the bottom line is politics to get new laws enacted that will end up somehow having favorable repercussions downstream. I say that both literally and figuratively, for the whatever animal it is or whatever ecosystem it is that interests you and that you want to protect.
So let's go to the free-form mode here, and whatever you want to talk about, you can talk about next.
Well, I've been ranting of late about this fragile, wondrous little spaceship that we're on, and I really see a bleak future for it. And I think the two bottom lines for me are this endless just acceleration in human population growth, which I think has already vastly exceeded our carrying capacity. A lot of people would say, no, we can sustain a lot more people with genetically engineered foods and so on. And they're talking now about no longer 9 billion people on the planet, but 11 billion. We can handle 11 billion. And I think the population should be reduced. Of course, this is about as impractical an idea as a man can have, but I strongly believe that. I think every time there's a new stoplight in a town or whatever, that's emblematic of the problems that we face. And the other really disillusioning thing for me is that corruption will always be alive and well in our species. And you're never going to save the Indonesian rainforest, for example, from, say, palm oil, palm tree development, because the politicians are always going to cave if they have enough money from whoever is making palm oil. And across the globe, that's true. And we're, you know, political systems are always corruptible. And I think that the combination of population growth and the corruptibility of men in power doom us. Sorry to say, I really think that we're in big trouble, and I even have great fears for my grandson, my children. My son is going to have to deal with a lot of this. Never mind my grandson. Don't hate to be so pessimistic, but that's my feeling. I don't know. We're freeform. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I keep wondering about women, because women care in a different, more built-in, fundamental way about sustainability in general, and I keep hoping they'll save us poor men from the fate.
I completely agree with you. We are the problem, our gender. is the problem. Yeah, women are they are intuitively nurturing.
Yeah.